Hello somebody and welcome back to Space Engineers. Today I'll be showing tips and tricks about making rovers, including where and when they are most effective. Now before starting any build in Space Engineers, I like to ask myself three questions. Where do I want this build to go? What's its purpose? And what size do I want it to be? For my build, I'm going to be making my rover on Pertam as a utility combat rover with emphasis on the combat, and in small grid, hopefully smaller than a 4x4 large block area. First, I'm going to be making a basic small grid chassis as a base for improvement that's going to be using 5x5 wheels and blast doors as the main block. Alright, and as you can see, I've made the chassis a 6-wheel configuration. This makes the build both more resilient to impacts and losing wheels, so you can drive a bit faster than the 4-wheel config. Also, the reason why I made the chassis out of blast door blocks was that so the center of mass would be closer to the ground, which makes the rover harder to spin out and flip. As a side note, blast doors are cheaper than heavy armor and artificial mass blocks, making them both easier to get early game and replace if you break them. Alright, so next is figuring out where you want to put the helm or cockpit of your rover. Now for most rovers, it's usually a good idea to put them in the very front of the build, so that you'll have good visibility when you're in the cabin if you're in a first-person server, or, you just want to make it look like a car and you have the driver's seat in the front. But for me, I'm going to be putting mine a wee bit in the back, like right about there. Because I'm going to be doing combat and I don't want my cockpit to get shot at first, because that'd be a bit hard to drive if you can't actually be in the cockpit, Next, you want to figure out where you're going to put the connectors on the build. I usually like putting mine on the very back or on the bottom of a build, somewhere around here. 1 second. Okay, right there. I like putting them on the bottom so that you can just shorten the size, the height offset of the wheels, and just lower this down to the ground whenever you need it. And you can also have it on the back so you could just back up into whatever connector you want. But you can just have one of the two. Now you gotta figure out where you're gonna put your battery and your cargo containers on the build. Now, if your rover's going to be for cargo transporting, there's obviously going to be a lot of cargo containers. But since mine is for combat as well, I'm probably just gonna have a medium cargo container and a battery right in front of it. I put the battery in front of it so that it'd be able to soak up some damage when it gets shot at, so if I do have any ammunition stored in there, it doesn't explode right off the bat. I don't want to cook off like a Russian tank. Also, as a side note, make sure that your build is completely conveyored up, because otherwise you won't be able to transport items in between connectors, because you won't have any connectors. And if you're gonna have something like a rocket turret or assault cannon turret, you gotta make sure you use the larger connectors for that, because they won't actually be able to fit through these small ones here. They can only fit through the big openings of like the connector and the medium conveyors. Lastly, before you go any further, you need to add gyroscopes to your build. I know that a lot of people usually don't add these to their rovers for some reason, because they just think that it's unnecessary to have something like this. However, it is really, really a good idea, and I cannot stress that enough. Because if you do end up rolling over your rover, you won't be able to flip it back up unless it has a gyroscope. And also you can just set it to override so it doesn't flip over even easier. It's just that easy. Lastly, you want to add utility blocks like turrets and armor. Armor is absolutely necessary because otherwise you're just going to break your blocks if you hit anything or get shot at. And turrets would be very useful because then you could shoot back. But if your build isn't going to be made for combat, you can also add more cargo containers, some batteries, some solar panels, maybe even a crane. That's a little bit more difficult though. I'd recommend watching someone else's video on that, as I do not understand how to do it yet. And with that, begin the time lapse. Alright, and with that, it looks like our rover's starting to shape up. Now, I did learn something about rovers recently, and it's that if you have some wheels in the very front of the rover, like some very small ones, let me find some real quick. Yeah, these two just fine. Just place them like that. Probably not that far in. One moment. Having them like right about here-ish, and then adjusting them so that they fit around all this stuff makes it so that if you do hit something head on, the wheels absorb most of the impact, so at worst only one or two of the blocks behind them will get damaged instead of something behind them exploding and causing like catastrophic damage. Also, it's a very good idea to have some spotlights, otherwise you won't be able to see very well. I'll do a little bit of touch-up and then I'll get back to you. Alright, and with that, it looks like we're pretty much done with the rover. Now, extra lastly, we're going to want to change the settings of the rover. One of the things that you want to do is you want to change all of the wheels to have a strength of 60%, or at least 60%. The only exception for this would be if you're doing a large grid build and it's going to have a lot of cargo and weight. Because if you have a, let's say you have a large grid container, like a large grid container, you've got two of those on a rover, you're probably going to want around 30% strength, something like that, just so that you can make sure to go over hills and still have most of your wheels touching the ground, because otherwise you'll just have a line of wheels and only 2 or 3 of them are going to be touching the ground. In this case, however, this rover is going to be much smaller than that, and although it's not going to have as much cargo capacity as everything else, I'm probably still going to set it to something like 50%, just so that I can guarantee that most of the wheels are going to be on the ground no matter what. Power should always be around 60%, that can be finagled with. Height offset needs to be max, almost all of the time. The only time you want to change that is when you're connecting to a bottom connector, like I have there. Oh, I didn't armor the bottom. I'll change that in a bit. The next thing that you're wanting to do is going to set groups for things. Like all of your wheels are going to be named wheels. All of your batteries are going to be named batteries. And all your gyroscopes. Just do this for all the stuff you have multiples of, including your lights. Because maybe you want to turn off all your lights at once. I'm going to do my spotlights separate though, so I can just turn those on and off whenever I need. Finally, your connectors. Actually, don't create a group for your connectors. You're going to want to rename them to whichever location they are, like the bottom connector and the rear connector. So let me find out which one this is real quick. That's the bottom connector. A really easy way to find out which one they are is simply by turning off one of them and just looking for the one that's off, so you can rename it that way. Also, as a bit of a side note for everything, rename all of your necessary stuff, like your block groups, to have like a letter for your rover in the middle of it, or in the beginning, so that you're only going to be able to see what you need to see when you're in like a large grid that it's connected to, because otherwise you'll just see batteries, lights, spotlights. That's going to be a little bit hard to see if you're connected to everything else, and you won't be able to tell what's what. But if you label it by letters, then it won't be a big deal. I'm just really slow at this, so give me a second. Also, if you do have any turrets, make sure to make a group for those too, so you can just turn those off whenever you need. And with that, I believe we are pretty much done. All that's left is to set up your hotbar, and that can be set up individual to how you want to use it. Like if you want a crane, you can have a turret controller. If you have turrets, you can have an AI on-off. You're going to need the connectors, like connector switch lock on there too. Maybe the height offset, your lights. That's pretty much it. And extra lastly, the last thing you're going to want on your build is going to be a projector. So that if you are planning on making this in survival, then you can just plonk a projector wherever you need it, and you can just start making it from there. Or if the rover got damaged in any way, you can just turn on the projector and start welding blocks up from there. It's pretty simple. And that should be it. Let me just get this to the ground real quick. I made a really weird entrance for mine, so it's nice and armored. Oh, also, absolutely last thing is to make sure that your wheels are correct in their turning. I just inverted mine. 1 second. There we go. I could make a whole entire video on the settings of wheels, because strength, power, height offset, friction, everything is just so individual that you have to make for each rover that it can literally take minutes, like 10 to 12 minutes, something like that. So maybe I'll make a whole separate video about it. I don't know. I'll have to see. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you learned some useful tips and have some cool ideas running amok in your brain. If you want to see the rover I made yourself, I'll include a link in the description. And please, if you enjoyed, please consider subscribing. And I will see you in the next adventure. Bye-bye!